Chapter 9. The Law of Liberty. Nothing is more indicative of our ignorance regarding the purpose and meaning of the Bible than the distinction which is often sought to draw between the law and the gospel. We are told of different dispensations, as though divine method of conducting the world changed after the fashion of political constitutions. If this were the case, we should never know under what system of administration we were living, for we could only be informed of these alterations by persons who were in the know with the divine power, and we should have nothing but their bare assertion to justify their claim. This is a logical outcome of any system which is based upon the allegation of specific determination by a divine autocrat. It cannot be otherwise, and therefore all such systems are destined sooner or later to fall to pieces, because their foundation of so-called authority crumbles away under the scrutiny of intelligent investigation. The divine ordering can only be known by the divine working, and the intelligent study of the divine working is the only criterion which the Bible, rightly understood anywhere, sets up for the recognition of truth. All of the Psalms are based entirely on this principle, and the Master claimed their testimony to this mission. He himself spoke of tradition as rendering void the true law of God, and so far from claiming to introduce any new dispensation, he emphatically declared that his special business was to fulfill the law, that is, to demonstrate it in all its completeness. If the law taught by Moses is true, and the Gospels preached by Jesus is true, then they are both true together and are simply statements of the same truth from different standpoints. And the proof of their truth will be found in their agreement with one another and with the universal principles of natural law, which we can learn by the study of ourselves and of our environment. If the Old and New Testaments are right in saying that the foundation of all other knowledge is that God is one, then we may be certain that we are on the wrong track if we think that divine truth can be different at one point to what it is at another. We realize the principle of continuity throughout physical nature, and if we see that the physical must originate in the spirit, we cannot deny the extension of continuity throughout the entire system. And therefore, if the message of the Old and New Testament are both true, we may expect to find the same principle of continuity running through them both. On investigation, this will be found to be the case, and no truer definition can be given of the gospel, and that is the law worked out to its logical conclusion. The law which the Bible sets forth from first to last is a law of human individuality. The Bible is the spiritual natural history book of man. It begins with his creation by evolution from the kingdoms which had preceded him, and it terminates with his hypothesis. The line is long, but it is straight, and it reaches its glorious destination by an orderly sequence of cause and effect. It is a statement of evolution of the individual as a result of his recognition of the law by which he came to be a human being at all. When he sees that this happened neither by chance nor by arbitrary command then, and not till then, will he wake up to the fact that he is what he is by reason of a law inherent in himself, the action of which he can therefore carry on indefinitely by correctly understanding and cheerfully following it. Liberty according to law. His first general perception that there is such a law at all is followed by the realization that it must be the law of his own individuality, for he has only discovered the existence of the law by recognizing himself as the expression of it, and therefore he finds that, before all else, the law is that he shall be himself. But a law which allows us to be ourselves is perfect liberty, and thus we get back to St. James' statement that the perfect law is the law of liberty. Obviously, it is not liberty to allow ourselves to be depressed into such a mental attitude of submission to every form and degree of misery as coming to us by the will of God, that we at last reach a condition of apathy in which one blow more or less makes very little difference. Such teaching is based on the devil's beatitude. Blessed are they that expect nothing, for they shall not be disappointed. But that is not the gospel of deliverance which Jesus preached in his first discourse in the synagogue of Nazareth. Jesus' teaching was not the deification of suffering, but the fullness of joy, and he emphatically declared that all bondage, everywhere which keeps us from enjoying life to the full, is the working of that power of the negative which the Bible calls a devil. To give up hope and regard ourselves as a sport of inexorable fate is not liberty. It is not obedience to a higher power, but abject submission to a lower. the power of ignorance, unintelligence, and negation. Harmony or pandemonium. Perfect liberty is the consciousness that we are not thus bound by any power of evil, but that on the contrary, we are centers in which the creative spirit of the universe finds particular expression. Then we are in harmony with its continual progressive movement forward, still more perfect modes of expression. And therefore its thought and our thought, its action and our action become identical, so that in expressing the spirit we express ourselves. When we reach this unity of consciousness, we cannot but find to it be perfect liberty for our own self-expression, being also that of the all-creating Spirit as it manifests in our individuality, is no longer bound by antecedent conditions, but starts afresh from the standpoint of original creative energy. This is liberty according to law, the law of all creating harmony, in which God's way and our way coincide. The idea of liberty without a unifying harmony as its basis is inconceivable, for with everyone struggling to get their own way at someone else's expense, you create a pandemonium, and that is just why there is so much of that element in the world at the present time. But such an inverted idea of liberty is based on the assumption that man does not possess the power of controlling his condition by his thoughts. In other words, the flat denial of the initial statement of Scripture regarding him, that he is made in the image and likeness of God. Once grant the creative power of our thought, and there is an end of struggling for our own way, and an end of gaining it at someone else's expense. For since by the terms of the hypothesis we can create what we like, the simplest way of getting what we want is not to snatch it from someone else, but to make it for ourselves. And since there is no limit to thought, there can be no need for straining, and for everyone to have his own way in this manner would be to banish all strife, want, sickness, and sorrow from the earth. Faith in God. Now it is precisely on this assumption of the creative power of our thought that the whole Bible rests. If not, what is the meaning of being saved by faith? Faith is the essentially thought, and therefore every call to have faith in God is a call to trust in the power of our own thought about God. According to your faith be it unto you, says the Old Testament. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, says the Old Testament. The entire book is nothing but one continuous statement of the creative power of thought. The whole Bible is a commentary on the text. Man is the image and likeness of God. And it comments on this text, sometime by explaining why, by reason of the oneness of the Spirit. This must necessarily be so, sometimes by incitement to emotional states calculated to call this power into activity, sometimes by precepts warning us against those emotions which would produce its inverse action, sometimes by the example of those who have successfully demonstrated this power, and conversely by examples of those who have perverted it, sometimes by statements of the terrible consequences that must inevitably follow such perversion, and sometimes by glorious promises of the illimitable possibilities residing in this wonderful power if used in the right way. And thus it is that all Scripture is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. 2 Timothy 3:16. All this proceeds from the initial assumption with which the Bible starts regarding man, that he is the reproduction in individuality of that which God is in universality. Start with this assumption, and the whole Bible works out logically. Deny it, and the Bible becomes nothing but a mass of inconsistencies and contradictions. The value of the Bible as a storehouse of knowledge and guide into life depends entirely on our attitude with regard to its fundamental proposition. But this proposition contains in itself the affirmation of our liberty, and the gospel preached by Jesus amounts simply to this, that if anyone realizes himself as the reproduction, in conscious individuality, of the same principles which the law of the Old Testament bids us recognize in a divine mind, he will thereby enter upon an unlimited inheritance of life and liberty. But to do this, we must realize the divine image in ourselves on all lines. Consistency. We cannot enter upon a full life of joy and liberty by trying to realize a divine image along one line only. If we seek to reproduce the creative power without its correlatives of wisdom and love, we shall do so only to our own injury. For there is one thing which is impossible alike to God and man, and that is to plant a seed of one sort and make it yield fruit of another. We can never get beyond the law that the effect must be of the same nature as the cause. To abrogate this law should be to destroy the very foundation of the creative power of thought, for then we could never reckon upon what our thought might produce, so that the very same law which places creative power at our disposal necessarily provides punishment for its misuse and reward for its right employment. And this is equally the case along the two other lines. To seek development only on the line of knowledge is to contemplate a store of wealth while remaining ignorant of the one fact which gives it any value, that is our own, and in like manner to cultivate only love makes our great motive power evaporate in a weak sentimentality which accomplishes nothing, because it does not know how and does not feel able. So here we see the force of the Master's words when he bids us aim at a perfection like that of our Father in heaven, a perfection based on a knowledge that all being is threefold in essence and one in expression, and that therefore we can attain liberty and only be recognizing this universal law in ourselves also, and that accordingly the thought that sets us free must be a simultaneous movement along all three lines of our nature. The divine mind may be represented by a large circle and the individual mind by a small one, but that is no reason why the smaller circle should not be as perfect for its own area as a larger, and therefore the initial statement of the Bible that man is the image of God is the charter of individual liberty for each one, provided we realize that this likeness must extend to the whole threefold unity, that is ourself, and not to part only. Our liberty, therefore, consists in being ourselves in our wholeness, and this means the conscious exercise of all our powers, whether our visible or invisible personality. It means being ourselves, not trying to be someone else. Universal principles. The principles by which anyone ever attains to self-expression, whether in the humblest or the most exalted degree, are always the same, for they are universals and apply to everyone alike. And therefore we may advantageously study their workings in the lives of others, but to suppose that the expression of these principles is bound to take the same form in us that it did in the individual who is the object of our hero worship, is to deny the first principle of manifested being, which is individuality. If someone towers above the crowd, it is because he has grown to that height, and I cannot permanently attain the same elevation by climbing on his shoulders, but only by growing to the same height myself. Therefore, the attempt to copy a particular individual, however beautiful his character, is bondage and a relinquishing of our birthright of selfhood. What do we have to do in studying these lives which we admire is to discover the universal principle which these persons embodied in their way, and then set to work to embody them in ours. To do this is to realize the universal I Am manifesting itself in every individuality, and when we see this, we find that the statement of the law of individual liberty is the declaration that was made to Joseph at the burning bush, and is the truth that Jesus proclaimed when he said that it was a recognition of the I Am that would set us free from the law of bondage and death. In speaking of the I Am as the principle of life, neither Jesus nor Moses used the words personally, and Jesus especially avoids any such misconstruction by saying, "If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true." John 5:31. In other words, he came to set forth not himself personally, but those great principles common to all mankind, of which he exemplified the full development. When a little child is first told that God made the world, it accepts the statement without doubting, but immediately and logically follows it up with a question, then who made God? And the unsophisticated mother very often gives the correct answer, God made himself. There is the whole secret, and when we come down, or rather when we rise to the level of these souls whose pure intuitions have not been warped by arguments drawn only from the outside of things, we see the principle of continual self-creation in all varieties of individuality affords a true clue to all we are and to all that is around us. And when we see this, the teaching regarding the I Am in ourselves becomes clear, logical, and simple. Then we understand the law of our whole being, that which is cause as well as effect. Is the reproduction and individuality of the same power which makes the worlds? And when this is understood in its wholeness, we see that this principle cannot, as manifested in us, be in opposition to its manifestation of itself in other forms. The whole must be homogeneous. That which is homogeneous cannot act in opposition to itself. And consequently, this homogeneous principle, which underlies all individuality and is the I am in each, can never act contrary to the law of life. Therefore, to know ourselves as a concentration of this principle into the focus of self-recognition is to be at one with the life principle, which is in all worlds and under all forms. The Son. It is this recognition of our own individuality as being a reproduction of the universal principle and the whole personally that constitutes belief in the Son, or the principle of spiritual sonship, which brings us out of bondage into the liberty of knowledge and power. But the reader, who is still within the trammels and traditional exegesis, will probably say, if this be so, what is meant by such text is that contained in the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. He was wounded for our transgressions, etc. And the answer is that the personality here spoken of is still the same typical man, the divine Son, who is described by Isaiah as the wonderful child. Only seen from another point of view, this is a description of him in this prenatal state, that is, before his manifestation as a son, whose name is Wonderful, Counselor, etc. Spirit ever conscious. And this brings us to the consideration of a very recondite subject, the question whether spirit ever does pass into unconsciousness. Whether from the physiological or the psychological side, there is important evidence tending to the conclusion that spirit is never in a condition of unconsciousness. And if this is the case with that concentration of pure spirit, which is the individualized I am in each of us, how can we conceive it suffering from these transgressions of the law of our own being, which results in all the misery, pain, and death that the world has witnessed? If the spirit in us is the very impersonation, individualized in the person, or no suggestion of fraud is intended, of the law of life, what wounding, what bruising we must suffer in the course of educating the lower principle in self-recognition and spontaneous compliance with the true law of the individuality in its wholeness. Then we see that it is only by infinite persistence of the spirit in its struggle towards perfecting the vehicles of its self-expression that the individuality in all its completeness can ever be brought to maturity, and the crown set to the work of evolution which commenced far back in the dim, unfathomable past. We realize St. Paul's meaning in saying that the Spirit groans with unutterable groaning, for it is that principle which St. John tells us cannot sin, that is, cannot act contrary to the true law of being, and thus a peculiar emphasis is set on the injunction, grieve not the Spirit, quench not the Spirit, for the individualized spirit is the intensely living center of ourselves, the I am that I myself am in every one of us. Natural education. The question of the ultimate consciousness of the individuality under the outward semblance of unconsciousness, as in trance or under the conditions induced by hypnotism or anesthetics, involves problems of a scientific character which I hope to have an opportunity of discussing on another occasion. But even supposing there is no such latent consciousness of suffering as I have suggested, we may well transfer the whole description of the 53rd chapter of Isaiah to the conscious sufferings of the outer man. That, at any rate, is a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and the reason of these suffering is the want of wholeness. They are the result of trying to live only in one portion of our nature, and at the lower instead of the whole, and consequently these sufferings will continue until we realize that even balance of all parts of our nature, which alone constitutes true individuality, or that which is without division, by the buffeting of experience, the lower personality is being continually driven to inquire more and more into the reason of its suffering, and as it grows in intelligence, it sees that they always result from some willful or ignorant infraction of the law of things as they are, as distinguished from things as they look. And so by degrees the lower personality grows into union with the higher personality, which itself is the law of things as they become personal, until at last the two are found to be one, and the perfected man stands forth whole. This is the process to which the writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews refers when he says that, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, Hebrews 5:8, thus indicating a course of education which can only apply to a personality whose evolution is yet not completed. But by these sufferings of the lower personality, the salvation of the entire individuality is at length accomplished, for, being thus led to the study of the law of the whole, the law or simply intellectual mentality at last discovers its relation to the intuitive and creative principle, and realizes that nothing short of harmonious union of the two makes a complete man. Until this recognition takes place, the real meaning of suffering is not understood. To talk about the mystery of pain is like talking of the mystery of broken glass if we throw a stone at a window. It is of our own making. We attribute our suffering to the will of God simply because we can think of nothing else to attribute them to, being ignorant alike of ourselves as centers of causation and of God as a universal life principle, which cannot will evil against anyone. So long as we are at this stage of intelligence, we esteem the lower personality, the only self we yet know, to be stricken and smitten of God. We put it all down to God's account, while all the time the cause of our wounding and bruising was not the will of God, but our own transgression and iniquity. Transgression, the infraction of the law of causation, and iniquity, unequalness, or the want of even balance between all portions of our individuality, without which the liberating recognition of our own I-amness can never take place. This reading of this wonderful chapter, Isaiah 53, takes it out of the region of merely speculative theology and brings it into a region where we can understand its statement as links in a chain of cause and effect, connecting the promised redemption with facts that we know and starting from causes whose working is obvious to us. This reading in no way detracts from the value of this passage as a prophecy of the great work of the Master, for it is a generic description applicable to each, in his degree, who in any way labors or suffers for the good of others, and the description is therefore supremely applicable to Jesus, in whom the perfect individualization of the divine of which we speak was fully accomplished. A gospel of peace. The law of man's individuality is therefore the law of liberty, and equality is the gospel of peace. For when we truly understand the law of our own individuality, we see that the same law finds its expression in everyone else. And consequently we shall reverence the law in others exactly in proportion as we value it in ourselves. To do this is to follow the golden rule of doing to others what we would they should do unto us. And because we know that the law of liberty in ourselves must include the free use of our own creative power, there is no longer any inducement to infringe the rights of others, for we can satisfy all our desires for the exercise of our knowledge of the law. As this comes to be understood, cooperation will take the place of competition, with the result of removing all grounds of enmity, whether between individuals, classes, or nation, and thus the continual recognition of the divine or highest principle in ourselves brings peace on earth, goodwill among men, naturally in its train, and it is for this reason that the Bible everywhere couples the reign of peace on earth with the knowledge of God. The whole object of the Bible is to teach us to be ourselves, and yet more ourselves. It does not trouble itself with political and social questions, or even with those of religious organization, but it goes to the root of all, which is the individual. First set people right individually, and they will naturally set themselves right collectively. It is only by applying to mankind the old proverb, "Take care of the pence, and the pound will take care of themselves." And therefore the Bible deals only with the two extremes on the scale, the universal mind and the individual mind. Let the relation between these two be clearly understood, and all other relations will settle themselves on lines which, however varied in form, will always be characterized by individual liberty working to the expression of perfect social harmony. End of chapter.